Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone. My name is Joe Johnson. Welcome to the second in our three-part webinar series on emergency management. Each webinar addresses one of the three stages: prepare, respond, and recover. We're going to show you how GIS helps utilities and telecoms manage major events. These could be wildfires, earthquakes, hurricanes, snowstorms, floods, literally any major event that disrupts utility and telecom infrastructure and service to their customers. Last week, we discussed how utilities and telecoms use GIS to prepare for an event. During today's webinar, we will show the power of ArcGIS to provide rapid assessment, awareness, and outreach during the critical respond stage. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch in approximately 1 week. Please enter your questions or comments in the questions dialog box at any time during the presentation. If we have time, we will answer questions at the end of the webinar. In any case, we will send the answers to all your questions in a document along with the link to the recording. So please don't hesitate to submit those questions. Joining me today are several of my colleagues. Bill Meehan, Director of Electric Utility Solutions. Zachary Aguayo, a solution engineer who supports our electric, gas, and telecom teams. And finally, Jonas Rugies, a solution engineer who supports the Esri water team. Here's our agenda for today. Bill will give us a review of the webinar series and of last week's webinar. Zach will demonstrate a process for capturing damages quickly. Jonas will follow up with two demonstrations, one on situational awareness and the other on a critical activity during a major event, which is communication to the public. And finally, Bill will do a quick wrap up. We have a lot to get through, so let's get started. Please welcome Bill Meehan.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for attending last week and now this week. Over the course of these three webinars, we address how GIS and location intelligence transforms the way utilities and telecoms deal with all kinds of disastrous events. The three stages of emergency management are, as Joe has stated, prepare, data and processes that must be put in place well in advance of a major event. Respond, the actions that matter most while the event is happening or just after. And recover, the sun is shining, the earth stops shaking, the wind is calm, the fire is contained, but the infrastructure is severely damaged. This requires a different set of data and processes. And of course, we want to continuously learn about what we did and what we didn't, what worked and what didn't. Today, we'll deal with the second stage, respond. So we're right in the middle of an event. Operating managers have several key decisions to make and people to inform. It's a time of great chaos and stress. During times of great stress, people make mistakes. That's why accurate and timely information is vital. Well, I've been there. I ran electric operations for a power company in the northeastern part of the United States. There's so much information to process. There's no time for strategic analysis. Things must happen now. Decisions need to be made. Whether before, during, or after a storm or any other emergency event, there are issues. So let's walk through some of those issues. As I stated last week, it's a puzzle to solve, no matter what stage of emergency management you're in. First, disparate data, imagery, spreadsheets, news reports, phone calls. They're in different formats, different levels of accuracy. How about those manila folders stuffed with printouts, forms, paper maps, sticky notes, and pictures? The next is a lack of analysis. There is a need for fast results. For example, during a wildfire, there's no time to spend a week studying wind direction impacts. And next is silos of processes. I can tell you, nothing stresses an organization more during a disaster than bureaucracy and silos and non-integrated systems. And finally, lack of collaboration. This inhibits communication and coordination when you need it the most. So ArcGIS pulls the pieces of the puzzle together. Well, how? Well, ArcGIS organizes intelligence by location. All kinds of information, from weather to infrastructure to historic maintenance, all kinds of things. But today there's an additional piece of information that we now must consider that we never had to before. Of course, that's the data on COVID-19. Companies might ask themselves, well, how do I get this data? Well, fortunately, over 3,700 organizations worldwide are using Esri technology for tracking COVID-19 cases. There are hospitals that are open and spread analysis and all kinds of data around COVID-19. Well, that data can be treated like any other data that we get in ArcGIS. It's easily consumed within the utility and telecoms dashboards, and it can be used as a basis for analysis. It allows decision makers, as we like to say, to see what others can't. It fuses information together to provide actionable intelligence. A quick glance at this slide shows that that's just a sample of things operating managers must consider during a major event. It can be truly overwhelming. This reminds me of a time when I worked for the power company. My old boss, Bob, had a thirst for actionable intelligence, yet he never seemed to get it. Bob ran electric operations at the time. So we would get major storms, regularly. One of the decisions Bob had to make was when to secure mutual aid crews. Bob was consistently frustrated. Making that decision was very costly. So if the crews arrived and we didn't need them, Bob would have to explain why he pulled the trigger too soon. If he'd gotten burnt several times. If he waits too long, then the nearby crews are spoken for. Then restoration takes longer. Either he'd have to explain why he wasted money by calling in crews that he didn't need, or he would have to explain why he didn't call in crews in time and restoration took longer than our neighboring utilities. He could just never win. What Bob didn't have was information needed to make the right decision. That's why ArcGIS is transformational. So Bob needed better information to prepare well in advance of an event. He needed rapid assessment during and just after the event, and of course he needed much better methods for the long-term recovery. So you might say the overarching theme for this webinar series, the whole series, is prepare strategically, respond rapidly, and recover methodically. Last week, we discussed how to prepare using GIS strategically for an emergency event. We highlighted 3 elements during the prepare stage. First, we needed to obtain as much data about external impacts, things like flood zones, fire zone areas, and tornado paths, and lightning area. This is the data that Bob would have loved to have known, but he just didn't have the access. With ArcGIS, the Living Atlas, and partners like FEMA and USGS, we have all the data and it's up to the minute. ArcGIS consumes that data live via web services. There's no more wondering if the old flood map stuffed in the cabinet is accurate. Second is to get full understanding of where the network, electric, gas, telecom, and water, is the most vulnerable. Also, understanding where critical devices such as valves or switches will be unavailable during an event. Finally, merging that external impact data with the network vulnerability provides a basis for scenario building. My old boss would have loved this. This provides the basis for decision making based on timely and accurate data, something my boss just didn't have, and he paid the price. Okay, so now the storm is here, the earth is shaking, fire is still uncontained, and the wind is still blowing. During the response stage of emergency management, there are 3 elements. Damage assessment, which means, how much work is ahead of us. Situational awareness, what's happening right now and at all times during this respond phase. And of course, most importantly, public outreach. All right, so let's take a look at damage assessment. Well, I'll never forget a big storm we had on the 4th of July. We had mini tornadoes, gusts exceeding 100 miles an hour, lightning, devastating rain, and coastal flooding. And, we had very little warning. Many of the workers were on vacation. It was a mess. We had major outages, tons of damage. We had to engage accountants, secretaries, anybody could go out in the field and figure out what was going on. And of course, we used paper forms. It took us days to get a full handle on how much work was ahead of us. And before we could prioritize the work and effectively do the recovery effort, we just needed to know what was going on. What we needed most was rapid damage assessment for rapid decision making. So you might have these questions. How can rapid damage assessment be transformed with location technology? how can it be performed quickly, and how to engage untrained personnel. So I'm going to turn it over to Zach, and Zach's going to show us how we can answer these questions using ArcGIS for rapid assessment. Take it away, Zach.
Hey, thanks, Bill. Major events happen all the time, and having a crew sufficient enough to assess damage can be a challenge in itself. Using simple applications to collect data can greatly expand your user base, helping you respond faster in an emergency. With a camera attached to my vehicle and an iPad in hand, users in your organizations are ready to assess damage, whether they're an accountant from finance or a hired contractor. Before beginning, let's switch on real-time notification. This will allow your organization to understand and verify where they have been. They can use this information to inform field users of dangerous situations reported that they may not be aware of. So let's begin identifying some damage throughout the neighborhood. Driving down Donner Pass Road, users can quickly respond to down assets by simply pressing one of these large buttons onto the left. An image on the button will help them easily associate the correct asset that was damaged, giving them the ability to move quickly, such as a down pole. After each item is collected, the office will now see a photo of the damaged asset, the user who collected the asset, as well as the precise GPS location of that asset. Having the ability to move quickly and collect data in such an emergency can help the office set priorities for restoration of services and to ensure the community is safe. Here at the intersection of Donner Pass and the Vaughn Road, a critical streetlight is out. Since there isn't a button for streetlight, the user will have to send a manual note. Further down the Vaughn Street, the water main had burst, since the road is separating here. The main supplies Tahoe Hospital, a critical customer, with water. So reporting it will help the office assign a higher priority to work so it can be repaired as soon as possible. I'll click on water main here. Earlier, the team identified critical customers throughout the city that might have been severely impacted by this event. However, with the recent pandemic of COVID-19, many temporary care facilities have appeared in hotels that the team may not be aware of. Further down the street on the east side of the hospital, a hotel has been converted to a temporary coronavirus care facility. Collecting a point here will help the office identify it and respond to their needs safely. Giving users the ability to quickly address and report issues regardless of their skill set can be crucial during an emergency. Additionally, having a map with all the assets displayed can help them better understand where things are, preventing them from assessing areas out of the territory. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Bill.
Well, thanks, Zach. But I have a question. You discovered a streetlight, and you called it a critical streetlight out to the entrance to a hospital, and you captured that information. While streetlight outages are not normally a high priority during a major event, in this case, given the COVID-19 crisis, access to critical care facilities, both established ones like hospitals and temporary ones, people will need to find those locations. So it's really critical to get lighting there. You had to type in the critical streetlight outage. You had to use the little green type thing there. But let's say it turns out that this is more common than we had originally planned. Show us how easy it is to add a new button on your Quick Capture app.
Sure, Bill. Let me jump over to the Quick Capture Designer. It's really easy to reconfigure this application to add new buttons for things that you capture in the field, such as streetlights. All you need to do is essentially drag down a button, label it and stylize it, and connect it to data and push that off to the field. So I've actually already created one here called Streetlight Out. Once I save my project, that is pushed out to my Quick Capture application. And when I go back to my tablet and exit out of Quick Capture, I see that there's an update available. If If I tap on the project and update, immediately that button's been added to my project.
Cool. So that's great. So you can add as many buttons as you want, and especially even like during the middle of the capturing, if you see something that just repeats over and over again. And what I like most about this little app is that you can use it without people being trained. So Zach illustrated rapid data collection just by driving by. People don't need training, and as we will see later, the data is available to anyone who needs it. In the old days, we would send people out in the field with paper forms and cameras and pencils and everything else, and then we'd have to deal with piles of paper and photos. Then we have to put all the pieces together just to figure out what the damage is. Well, not anymore. We were interested in rapid damage assessment, but we didn't want to linger to get more information. But if we need more detail, we can use two mobile apps from Esri, Survey 123 for ArcGIS and Collector for ArcGIS. These are easy to use as well. Survey 123 provides a form-based data collection, and Collector provides additional accurate positional and capture capability. Use of these apps will depend on the extent of the damage or the degree of training that the people collecting the information would need. They can be used, so just because you pick one or the other, that's okay. They can be used in combination with one another. The results for each of these apps are available immediately to the rest of the enterprise. For what? Decision-making and logistics. Okay. Now that we've collected the damage information, we must now pull all that information together with additional data. Some of that data we may have already collected. We illustrated, the impact data in last week's webinar. Information such as critical facilities, such as a pumping station, substations, police and fire stations, all kind of flooding information, lightning, all that sort of stuff. And of course, we will also need access to COVID-19 data as well. So decisive action requires answering these questions. How can location technology create clarity of damage? My old boss, Bob, would be smiling. How can network modeling enhance understanding? Where are the critical switches, valves, and cell towers that we have to deal with? And then probably the most important thing is what's going on right now. So Jonas, I'm going to turn it over to you now. So show us how you could answer these questions. So take it away, Jonas.
Thanks, Bill. So back in the operations center, whether we're in an EOC looking at a big screen dashboard or in a tent that's functioning as the EOC looking at a tablet, as a utility manager or incident commander, anyone responsible for these people out in the field responding to this event, they have real-time access to the situational view showing the location of field crews coming from their mobile devices and that tracker application, location of vehicles coming in from an integration of GeoEvent server, and the damage assessments that are being collected in real time. So if I zoom into this area near the hospital that Zach's working in and turn on those damage assessments, I can see that information that he's collecting. I can see the summary over here on the right-hand side and the individual points. And I can even see Zach's location and the vehicle he's in here on the map. So it's essential for any mobile workflow to have a corresponding operations dashboard so that decision makers can see these key performance indicators and make better decisions based on situational awareness. And I'd also like to mention that with Tracker, we're also looking at where field crews have been. So let me change the background so we can see the tracks a little better here. And zoom out a bit farther so we can see a few more workers. Now this is important during a normal emergency to make sure people are staying safe, but especially so during the COVID-19 pandemic. If a utility is attempting to comply with social distancing guidelines, trying to limit or eliminate person-to-person or even person-to-asset contact, this is an excellent tool to track where people have been and ensure that we're keeping utility staff and customers as safe as possible. Now, we need a lot more information than just field crew locations and damage assessments to understand the emergency situation. So I'll switch to this dashboard where we're looking at critical facilities and other relevant information across the service territory. This is data that's important for utilities to have on hand and have applications like this configured and ready to go before the emergency. Now let me pick up on that wildfire scenario that Tyler had talked about in the first webinar. So I'll go ahead and turn on that fire starting point. Let's assume that a new fire is just broken out in this location. And I'll also add the projected fire path that's been determined based on wind speed and direction. And we can take a look at what critical infrastructure lies in the path of this fire. And this is where it's so important to have utilities securely sharing information with each other and with emergency responders during the event of a disaster. So we can see what infrastructure is in this area. So we've got a water pump station. This is information being shared by the water utility. And we can see, based on the real-time information coming from that SCADA historian being pulled in by GeoEvent server, that the last update was within the last 5 minutes. So we know this pump station is still operational, and that's a critical asset that needs to be protected so firefighters can fight fires in this area. Now, next I'd like to take a look at a larger regional view and all the information that can be brought in when it comes to weather and what's going on right now. So what we're looking at is live radar feeds, live stream gauge information across the United States. And here in Northern California, we're viewing things like wildfire locations, radar, lightning strikes, and wind speed. But as I pan to the east side of the country, crossing over the Mississippi area where we have a lot of stream gauges at high flood stage. But if I pan out to the Atlantic Ocean here, we can see that that tropical storm Arthur is thankfully headed out to sea. But this is just the beginning of the Atlantic hurricane season, and it's very important to have information like this ready to go when planning and responding to emergencies. Now, there's one last thing I'd like to mention because we get a lot of questions about disconnected workflows. So let's say this is a major emergency like a hurricane, like an earthquake, where these cell towers that we're seeing here might be damaged and there may be no mobile data available. Well, that's where these staging areas represented by the orange pins and the black circles come into play here. As mentioned in the first webinar, these have been strategically placed based on spatial analysis. And hotspots can be set up at these staging areas and workflows based on these locations. So we've already calculated the drive times around these areas. So field workers can be assigned to a specific area and regularly go back to that hotspot, sync their updates when they go to take a break and get something to eat. And information is still available in near real time to decision makers in information products like this that provide that situational awareness. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Bill.
Well, thanks, Jonas. During last week's webinar, I showed a picture of a coffee-stained manila folder. A viewer commented that during an emergency, they lose power, Wi-Fi, and sometimes even their GIS. So I appreciate you mentioning that and to show how we can use these apps even in a disconnected mode. So Jonas answered the question, what's going on right now? He showed real-time locations of crews, relationships of weather and events. He was able to show us patterns in relationship. He demonstrated how GIS fuses real-time data and historic data, uncovers critical relationships, and gives us real-time awareness. Too often we think of GIS as a map-making machine. Yes, it certainly can produce beautiful maps, but ArcGIS is about discovery. This leads to making informed decisions right now. I fly a lot. Well, at least I used to. Things happen, mechanical breakdowns, weather delays, all kinds of things. What differentiates an okay airline from a great one? Well, it's certainly on-time departure. Well, that's sure. But I believe even more important than that is great communication. I can't tell you how many times I stood at the departure gate, the departure time has passed, and you know what? No one says anything. Most people can deal with bad news, but there's nothing more frustrating than no news. Sometimes there's an attitude of utilities and telecoms that it's a waste of time to communicate. It will delay progress in fixing the problem. Not so. Communication from utilities and telecoms is critical during times of great stress. So thus, the third element during the response stage of emergency management is public outreach, communication. There are 3 questions to answer. How can ArcGIS collaboration tools improve public outreach? How can disparate data be combined like COVID-19 data into utility dashboards? And how quickly can this be set up? So I'm going to turn it back to Jonas again. Jonas, please show us how to extend the information we've captured internally for public consumption. Jonas?
Sure thing, Bill. And I'll use that example that Zach had mentioned earlier about collecting that critical main break information to a line that serves the hospital here. This is why it's so important to share information to utility operators and emergency personnel. So here we're looking at the hospital, and we're also looking at the water infrastructure. We can see the water mains, the valves, the fire hydrants. We can quickly identify what valves need to be shut in order to isolate that part of the network. But communicating information about outages, whether it's water, electric, gas, or other services, is very important for utilities during an emergency. And securely sharing that information internally, and then as Bill mentioned, sharing it externally with customers during the event is very important. And applications can be pre-configured to manage both that internal data sharing and getting information out to customers. So here's an application designed to manage outages of the water system. Now, in the first webinar, Jason shared how analytical tools like a valve isolation trace can be used to very accurately determine what infrastructure will be impacted by an outage, what customers will be out of service, and what hydrants will be affected. But any utility can provide an app like this, especially in emergency, to engineers, operators, customer service to draw in the outage area and communicate this information immediately with anyone who needs it at the utility. So let's say this entire neighborhood is going to be out of service. What I'll do is enter in some basic information about the outage, like the time and date it started, when we expect it to be resolved. Obviously, this is unplanned, caused by, in this case, an earthquake. So put the leak cause as other, and we can manage all the different types of information here, like what it'll take to repair this, and communicate that out. But we don't want to share all this information with the public, and we also don't want to host this information when we do share it with the public behind our firewall. So it's a best practice to host this public-facing view that is created when I select share publicly equals to true here in ArcGIS Online. So internally, the utility can manage this information, and then the public can log on to the utility website. Here's a public-facing map, and view outage information in their area. And like I mentioned, it's really a best practice to have this set up beforehand where the utility is not hosting these public-facing apps behind their firewall. So if this gets mentioned on the news and 20,000 people hit it, the utility's infrastructure that's powering these mission-critical workflows in the field and the office are not impacted. And this is a great way to share not only outage information, but also road closures, any current alerts and advisories. So our recommendation is to have these apps configured, this publicly available data ready to go, so that a utility can scale up and meet the needs during an emergency situation. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Bill.
Well, great. Thanks, Jonas. So ArcGIS makes it so easy to communicate to the public and really anyone outside the utility, government, first responders, healthcare providers, the media, anytime, anywhere, on any device. And I think Rodney from Dominion Energy said it well. Knowledge may not be as good as power, but it helps customers better manage the situation. So what are the key takeaways for the response stage of emergency management? Well, first of all, damage assessment. To help people like my old boss, Bob, you need solid data about damage. But if it takes too long, work can't be staged, staffing can't be determined, and maybe even lives will be lost. Second, situational awareness. Once you have a full picture of the damage, then you need to create a full understanding of what's going on right now. Where are there clusters of damage? Where to send crews? Where's COVID-19? What's the weather right now? What valves are under the water? What critical facilities need immediate attention? Maybe where to send even emergency generators. And number three, public outreach. Give people as much information as possible without violating the mission. Once the event has passed, now it's time for the arduous task to rebuild. That will be our topic for next week's webinar, the recovery phase. For that, tune in next week. So back to you, Joe.
Great. Hey, thanks, Bill, Zach, and Jonas. Those were excellent demonstrations. It looks like we have run out of time for questions. As I stated in the beginning, we'll be sending out answers to your questions along with the recording of this webinar soon. We hope that we have given some concrete ideas for managing the difficult response stage of an emergency event. Just like a quick reminder that we have completely restructured our Esri International User Conference, and it's going to be going virtual this year, and it's free to all customers who are current in their maintenance. As a customer, the UC is available to everyone in your organization, but you must register. So this concludes our webinar. Please join us next week at the same time when we address how GIS is a key technology to help you recover after the event. Thanks, everyone, and hope to see you next week.